This is a live mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
All right. Okay, welcome to the Kennebunkport Planning Board April 3rd edition, I guess. Attendance, we have a full board. How about that?
Pretty exciting.
And it says approval of minutes. The minutes are not yet done, so we will approve 2 sets next time, I guess. Which brings us right into item 190101, Lord and Harrington, the Sanctuary, Sebago Techniques, authorized agent, continued deliberations. So, Steve.
Thank you. Before I get into the letter, I was digging through my files, and I think I might have even gotten this plan from Warner, but last meeting, there was talk about the building being set 75 feet from the watermark. And this is an old drawing dated 1976, which is about the time the building, which was when the building was built. And it actually shows, you probably can't see from there, but this is the existing house, this is Ocean Avenue, this is the shoreline, and they actually show, which I've highlighted in red, is the 75-foot setback, and the building complies with that. I don't know how accurate the survey was at the time compared to what we have today, but I look further at, if you look further at our plan, it's really only where this property is indented here that you have that violation of the 75-foot setback. If you were to project this shoreline across, the building is outside the 75 feet. So I don't know if it was just a bad survey in 76. I really don't know if there was really any erosion in that spot to create that, but just to kind of clarify some of the concerns about the 75-foot setback, I thought I'd at least show you that the building was originally 75 feet. I can pass this around if you want to see that.
Yeah, sure.
But it's still in resource protection.
Pardon?
It's still in resource protection zone.
Yeah, the whole property, but I know there was talk about the 75.
Yes.
Separate issue, you're right.
Separate issue, yes.
Artifacts.
Yeah. So Steve, you think you have a more precise survey now? Or perhaps the upland edge of the wetlands has changed?
The setback's measured from the high water mark, not the wetland line. The 75-foot setback is measured from the high water mark. I don't know how that survey was completed. It's fairly close, and again, I think it's only because of this little indentation here, and that it may not just be reflected in that survey. They may have, depending on how they did it, they may have just, I don't know, bypassed that indentation, or maybe that indentation happened within, you know, since that survey was completed. But
So that's the high water mark of the Lake of the Woods?
correct.
And based on this, the orange is
So
the
that really
proposed
shows a
building?
lake.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, that really shows a lake. I mean, I hadn't really appreciated that there was, I had envisioned this as wetlands and not as a lake.
Yeah, it's standing water there.
There is.
There's
shallow.
wetland vegetation, but it,
Okay.
yeah.
And the orange is the proposed
Very.
building and yellow is existing building?
Correct,
So the orange building is actually set back from the yellow building?
No, but you
Correct.
can't walk in it.
correct. Slightly, it's like 4 feet or so further back.
It's not tidal.
It's not tidal,
It's not tidal, right?
no.
This is,
No, it's fresh water, I believe. Brackish, maybe, yeah.
And there's wetland, but not right there. Right there, it's a lake shore.
Yeah, what you see in the green
Yeah.
is the wetlands, and then what's blue is the water level.
So north is that way, right? At the bottom of the page, yeah. North. I
Yes.
see the north, yeah. So where's the actual drain for this lake? Is it just, is there a little creek somewhere it drains out, or is there actually a free flow type of drain, you know?
I don't know if there is.
So it just,
It just goes with, it has to go with the tide, then, doesn't it? I mean, it's
No,
brackish.
if maybe if there's a culvert, maybe it's down closer to the bush compound, is my guess. That's about the lowest point in the area. There may be some culverts there that dump out.
So does this area ever have like a high water problem, you know, where it's gonna flood? I mean, if it, you know, we get snow and, you know, springtime snow melt, so does this ever, is the Blue Lake, is it ever threatened to overflow the road? Anywhere, or?
That I don't know.
Or
I
encroach
would-
on the house?
If it did, it would be down, again, down by the, I think by the bush compound. That's the lowest point of the road.
Well, I guess the question is, okay, so if you get, okay, so it sounds like there must be a drain somewhere, and that is preventing this from filling up during the spring snow melt, because, I mean, if that happened, the basement could easily flood. Is there a pump in the basement there?
No, we're way higher than any of that level. The road further down here is way lower than,
Okay.
so,
So that maybe that's the overflow
yeah.
backup.
There's gotta be an outlet for that area. There's
Yeah.
a good-sized watershed that feeds.
Okay.
Okay. So, the birds.
The birds. So, Kevin
Oh, yeah.
has done some research.
gotcha,
I've actually done some too.
Yeah, gotcha.
Looking at products to use on the windows. We first were leaning towards the film-based products, but after we started studying those, they're actually, it needs to be applied on the exterior of the window. The product has like a 10-year lifespan to it. Over time, it can peel, gets dirt and mildew and stuff behind it, so it's not really a good product for a long term. And also, according to Kevin, that any film that's applied to the windows, it voids the warranty on the window. So when you're spending that kind of money on windows, you don't want to devoid the warranty. So we ruled that one out. The only other one that we've, from looking at the glass itself, there's the film products, then there's also this one from a company out of Germany called Ornalux, where they actually create almost like a spider web pattern inside the glass. And it's a UV reflective kind of material that birds can see, but people can't. And I was doing a little more research, and not all birds see UV light. There are raptors and some other birds that it's not going to be effective for them. This particular product was used at UNE in one of the facilities that they just built there. It's a very pricey product, and I think it's the only one on the market that actually works in the glass, and it's like $80 a square foot. So for the cost of the windows on this project, you're looking at $80,000 to $90,000 upcharge to add that.
What's the total cost on the house estimate?
I'd have to look at Kevin on that. 2 million construction cost?
2 million? So that's a
Roughly
small
4%.
percent. So that's a small percentage of the construction cost.
Right.
About 20 years ago, they used to say a good house was $100 a square foot. That included the windows, too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, but I do note that this product doesn't save all the birds,
No.
because not all birds see UV light.
In
So
that estimate for $80,000, are you looking at all of the windows or the windows facing the lake?
Yeah.
All of the windows?
Yeah,
So your larger windows that the birds are more likely to strike, the ones facing the lake, can you get a cost estimate on that?
I think we have a lot of doors and smaller windows on the back.
so that's the back.
Right. I mean, railing, divided lights. You know, there's the front.
Could you, front and back, is that, which is facing
This
which?
faces Ocean Avenue. This
Okay.
faces Lake Road.
Thank you.
And a lot of, from what I was reading, and again,
A lot of it's migrating birds.
they were actually in this book here, they talk about all kinds of birds, and they're not specific to habitat areas. They've studied migrating birds, but in general, birds are coming from all different directions. It could be in the woodlots away from the shorelines where you get, you know, these impacts. They do talk about how many birds typically will hit a window on a house. which is where they come up with this, millions of birds killed a year. It's anywhere from 1 to 10 per year it strikes a house. They say the average is 2.1. I don't know where they got the 2.1, but they say an average of 2.1 birds hit windows as a fatality per year. Some of the things that they talk about are probably even better than these products is more screens. If you have an exterior screen on a window, that way the bird hits it, it can bounce off. Those are probably more effective than, some of these other items. And I don't know if these windows have, screen options for the lower half,
Yeah, I mean, it's an option. It's if they put them in or not.
Yeah.
The problem is a lot of the windows today, the screens are on the inside.
Only on a casement.
Casement
Double hungs,
windows.
They
have to be on the-
Those
yeah.
those are mostly double hung windows.
So double hungs have them on the outside.
And will they have screens?
They always come with them, whether the owner decides to use them or not.
So
In
will
Maine,
that,
they usually do.
Some of them, but on a couple of windows, but on every window, can't figure it out.
will the bigger windows have screens?
Every window, when it's ordered, and door comes with a screen.
Okay.
Can I ask what make they are? Because I know some windows do not come with screens, they're an optional item.
Unless they're
We-
fixed.
I just had some put in, and screens did not come with them at the basic price. They were extra.
We always order them to not get into were screens included
Kevin?
and not included. There's a-
Microphone?
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
There will be a pile of this, Kevin Lord and Harrington. There'll be a pile of screens in the basement. If they want to put them in, they can. We order them with every window, every door, just so we don't get into that situation.
I guess we're looking for
Guidance.
guidance.
Well, as somebody who's had windows, large windows, without any bird protection on them, I can tell you it's not fun to have my window washer come in and say, what's this stuff scribbled all over your windows, which is UV paint and stuff like that. But it's worse to see a dead woodpecker or a dead thrush on the ground,
And the UV does not work for thrushes and woodpeckers from what I was reading in, and maybe it's working at your house, but according to this
It's
document.
working at my house
Okay.
because I've seen a lot fewer birds since I put that up in
Yeah,
windows.
interesting.
The other thing is, I know Hastings very well and they're expensive. I've made them pay for a lot of things and I know the bills that have come in, so. Leaking windows, example from Marvin.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I don't think it's a big price to pay when you're putting it into a $2 million house in the middle of a bird habitat. I really don't.
Especially if you're not the one paying though.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
but, I know that cost is going to be transferred on to somebody, the buyer.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, Ralph Austin representing Lord and Harrington. This is also a bigger issue than this house. I mean, this board would be making a policy change, a major policy change. I don't know of any other house in town that either the code enforcement officer has approved or this board has approved that's required this type of glass. There have been a number of houses right on the ocean that have been torn down and new houses built without this type of protective glass. The Atlantic Ocean is as much a wildlife habitat for birds as Lake of the Woods is. It seems to me if you're going to make a policy change like that, it needs to be done on a more deliberate basis and not just applied to this one applicant tonight. I know this board doesn't like technical legal arguments. I've made a few and lost. I know you appreciate a common sense approach, but sometimes you do need to look at the language of the ordinance. And it's the wildlife habitat that is protected. It's not the approach to or from that habitat. There is one exception to that, and that's vernal pools. The habitat is the vernal pool itself, but by ordinance and state law, and I think federal law, there's a significant area around a vernal pool that is protected from development so that these little critters can get to the vernal pool. If the town wanted to adopt an ordinance that protected the flyway for migratory birds or other birds, they could, but they haven't. And I think that's a significant policy change that requires an amendment to the ordinance.
And I agree with you. I've spoken to the Maine municipal attorney on this, and she has spoken to her colleagues and come back on 1010A provisions. And it is the habitat that is protected. I'll agree with you there. I'm not happy about it. I'd like to see the town make a change. In fact, I'd like to see the whole state make a change. I think the cost of the glass would come down pretty fast after that. But what I would like to see is that instead of the screens going into the basement when you finish the house, I'd like to see the screens go up on the windows.
We always put them in. I don't know how long they stay in.
Okay?
They've got screen, it's a point well taken, Ralph, and I think that an ordinance ought to be considered. This is a different habitat than an ocean habitat. This is a freshwater habitat, and the migratory birds that are very, very different. I live on a marsh about half a mile from that, and the problem with glass is an actual problem. Screens are kind of mandatory in Maine if you got double hung windows, so I assume they would be in there. You're taking out some trees. So maybe some of the trees that are replanted could be positioned in a way that they might change some of the bird behavior around the windows without blocking the view. Does that make sense?
No.
The problem with the reason the birds are hitting the windows is they see the trees reflecting in the glass, and the trees are, the whole area is just, you're going to get it because the trees are so large.
They
There are
see
a lot
it
of
as an
birds.
extension of the environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is why, you know, in our reading on this, we see that most of the applications that have been done to this point, and cost is some of this, of course, too, but most of the applications have been larger structures with big planes of glass that are, you know, there's nothing else to tell the birds that this isn't open space that they should be flying into.
Right.
A house is different than that. Not to say that it isn't a problem, but it's not the same problem as UNE, for example, had with their building.
Well, some houses do have that problem. I have very large
You got a
15-foot
large window.
windows.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are no screens on those.
Yeah.
They're fixed in place. And that's when I had to move my bird feeders closer to the windows so they couldn't get up speed when they hit.
There was
that sort
another
of
thing I
thing.
read about bird feeders. You're attracting birds to that, which is kind of drawing them towards the windows, and most likely they could hit it that way, but
And they have to be the 3 or 4 feet from the window or 100 feet from the window.
yes, exactly.
Nothing in between.
Right, yeah.
So, okay. Well, I think you're right, Ralph. I'm not happy about it. I mean, if I made the ordinances, you'd be putting in the windows. But, but I'd like to see the screens go up on the windows. I'd like. Okay.
Okay. Now, are there other issues we need to talk
Yeah,
about on
bigger
this?
issues.
Yes.
Okay. When Ed raised the issue of expansion of use, I went back to the gristmill case, despite what you think. There is some applicability there, and reread the stuff on zones, overlaying zones, and restrictions and so forth. I don't recommend anybody else read it. Those 4 pages, you know, take hours. But there are a couple of things going on here, and I'm wondering if we're doing the right thing when houses come to us in the resource protection zone. It's not just this one. I think it's been other ones we've been looking at, whether we've been reading the ordinance correctly. One of the issues, a smaller issue, which I think could be, we could get an opinion from Amy and probably work with it, is that you've expanded the volume of this house actually beyond 30% if you consider the garage a garage and not as a basement. And if you go back and forth in the ordinance, you can find pros and cons for this. And I don't know where to go with it. Because if you, well, one thing you ought to do is look at your deed, because it has a stipulation in there about garages. But that's not in our purview. But you're putting a 3-car garage in there that's very large into part of the basement that's really isn't below grade there. And, you know, it says in the ordinance that, you know, you could finish your basement anyway, you could use it for storage, it's still not going to be counted in the space. But an attached garage is counted as space, not only as square footage, but as cubic footage volume.
That's not an attached garage, though.
But if you go to the dictionary, because we don't have a definition of a garage in there, you'll find all sorts of definitions. And one of them, you know, quite frequently is a building where cars are kept, except that, especially one that is next to or part of a house.
Okay,
All
but it
right.
says attached.
No, it's just a garage.
I know, but didn't you say the ordinance said attached garage?
Yeah.
The ordinance says attached garage, but you can consider a garage that's part of a house attached. I mean, it's not separate from the house. It's
The
not.
customary term attached garage means one
It's physically
like mine
attached to it.
sitting next to the house.
That's the
physically
way you
attached.
normally think of it, but there are other definitions that say an attached garage can be part of a house or sitting next to a house.
Nina, could you clarify what the concern is? I know we're talking about
concern is-
whether it's a garage or not, but I don't understand what the point
concern is
is.
that you have the garage, which they're considering part of the basement, so it isn't part of the square footage. That garage, if I take it from the estimates, is 160 square feet, which would put you over the allowed square footage
I
for
think,
expansion of
but
the
I think that
structure.
if you look at what they've done, and I'm willing to, I don't mean to jump on this, but you excluded the basement
The
area.
basement we excluded.
Including the garage under, including the garage,
We
in both
included the
before
garage
and
because-
after.
I believe we included the garage because that's not a basement structure. We included, if I can go to the drawing.
The first garage was not in the basement.
Correct.
It was
Okay.
not under the house, it was attached
So
separately.
that was included, you're
So
saying?
we included, this is the existing garage.
Yep.
We included that in our volume. But what we did not include is this part of the house that was the basement level.
Right.
We're using the new basement as a garage,
Right,
but
and you didn't include that either,
we're not including it because
in
it's in the
either the
basement.
before or the after.
Right. I mean, it's the volume's the same, but we're putting cars in there instead of having it as a basement. And there's a definition of what meets a basement is, I think it's 3 sides, or the certain percentage, has to be below grade. I think it's-
50%,
Pardon?
think it's
50% has
Yeah,
to
and
be
we're
below
under the
grade.
50%,
right.
so.
Yeah, you can call it a basement, but you can also call it a basement with an attached garage. And if you call it a basement, and I'm not including the garage, call it a basement with a garage, you would have to include that square footage and volume in the house. Now, I don't know the answer to this,
So why would we care,
because we should,
as a practical matter?
Because it's an increase in volume.
it's an increase in square footage and
It
volume.
wouldn't hit the 30% anymore. It would
You're
be
saying
more than
because
30.
some of the basement has been converted to a garage,
Yes,
you have a different problem?
yeah.
then you would,
It goes over the 30%
The
expansion.
basement is not figured into the original calculation,
Right,
Right.
and now we're throwing in a garage and saying, well, it's really basement,
in the basement,
but it's a
Right.
garage.
right.
But it's
Which
not-
is adding to the
But it's
volume.
not an attached
It's not an
garage.
attached
Not what
garage.
you
An
would
attached
commonly
garage.
call an attached garage.
That's correct.
So
But
is
it's,
that-
but
is
it's
that
no
the
longer a
issue that-
basement, it's a garage.
Well, if they put a playroom down in the basement, it's no longer a basement, it's a playroom.
But it's still a basement.
It's at the basement level. It's still living space, but we exclude it from the living space because it is in the basement.
And their prerogative.
That's what the ordinance says. That's why.
But the
I'm
ordinance
just
says a
saying,
garage is a
Why
garage.
would we, again, I'm inclined to think an attached garage means what I've commonly always thought of as an attached garage, first
Mm-hmm.
of all. So that's where I'm coming from. What we would be saying if we worry this issue is that depending on what use the basement is being used for, we include it in the volume or not. Right, and playrooms are okay, bars would be okay, workshops would be okay, we'd exclude all of that, but garages, we would not. Why would we do that? Why would we write an ordinance that way?
Because it is a garage.
In
And
the
the garage
basement.
Right, but
is,
it's
It's in the
detached.
basement. It's not an attached.
it's not an attached garage, it's not a separate structure.
If you define an attached garage only as a structure attached to the house.
Which is the common sense definition, and I suspect it's how this town has always interpreted that.
Okay.
I mean, I looked to Warner for that, but
I knew that bus was coming by.
So just so we have it straight, the original garage that's, I guess, still there, hasn't been torn down yet, right? That was always above ground and was never 50% or so underground?
Correct.
Okay,
But it's included
Just-
as a total volume.
Right.
right. But I'm just looking at the definition of of basement in the ordinance. It refers to
Yes.
any portion of a structure with floor to ceiling height of 6 feet or more and having more than 50% of its volume below the existing ground level. So I guess the question is, does the garage/basement fit within that definition that it can be defined as a basement and hence
Yes.
excluded from the volume?
Yes, it
That's
is.
where we're at. That's the question. Okay,
Yeah.
just making sure.
That's the question.
So it's a basement that happens to have garage doors on it.
Right.
I mean, the definition of basement doesn't specifically talk about, what types of uses that you may have in a basement.
Okay.
And so I think to Ed's point, whether it's finished living space or whether it's storage space, arguably, having a drive under garage, that's backfilled on three sides and has garage doors on one side, arguably based on the definition would still be classified as a basement.
Okay.
A lot of people just store stuff in their garage. They don't have
Pretty
to-
much. Nope. I can't fit a car in mine.
So are we going to define a garage that's within a basement as part of the basement? But this is what I don't want to make a decision on. This is what I'd really like to have an attorney like Amy make a decision on so that we can go forward with other resource protection zone, and shoreline zone.
Arguably, if I wasn't thinking about whether a vehicle would be stored in it, okay? So if this is a walkout basement, I'd still call it a basement. If somebody had an existing walkout basement and came in with an application to convert that part of that walkout basement to a garage, provided that all other, requirements are met, we wouldn't think any differently about that.
You wouldn't consider that a volume expansion when they converted it to a garage?
No.
I mean, that's what our argument is
Yeah,
that if
no,
you
I-
did that
I
conversion,
understand that,
you've
yeah.
increased the volume
Yeah,
and needs to go to the planning board.
yeah, I think
If they decide to leave their cars outside and turn this into a playroom, it's still a basement.
it's still a basement.
There you go.
Okay.
It is unclear.
It is unclear.
I think, I agree, it is unclear. I just, by definition of what a basement is, I think you can fit this, how they've constructed it, within the definition of a basement, and then can exclude, I guess, the volume of the new garage/basement from the total calculation.
Okay.
Does that get you there?
I think the ordinance ought to be clarified. I think the land use ordinance ought to be clarified to reflect that.
This is not the only place you would make that suggestion, though.
Oh, yes.
Just saying.
Yes, yeah.
We have a list.
I only have one more item.
It'd be a fun project.
Yeah, and just, in terms of a little bit of history, a lot of this language comes out of state shoreland zoning, where you're dealing with, expansions and structures within a shoreland zone. I don't know that you ever find an ordinance that specifically gives you answers for every situation.
No.
I think part of the reason why the state shoreland zone guidelines, why they work to specifically exclude crawl spaces and basements, is that there are other provisions that allow for the height of homes to be increased and have it not be considered an expansion. And so I think that was I would say the conundrum that they ran into, is that, well, what happens if somebody goes from a crawl space and raises the height of it and now it becomes a basement?
Yeah.
What do we want to call that? Do we want to call that an expansion or not? And I think it was because of that scenario, they stayed away from it, and they just said, you know what, basements are not gonna, we're just not gonna calculate them at all. We're not gonna consider them as an expansion. And I think just because of the practicality of homes being lifted, but essentially going from crawl space to basements.
Well, we do have height limitations,
Right.
so
Yeah.
35 feet, so.
But I think that's why, when you look at shoreline zone guidelines, why they just stay away from not calculating basements or crawl spaces in any of the volume or area counts.
Well, one of the reasons is that it doesn't affect the footprint. It really doesn't affect the footprint that much because it's within the same area. You're not expanding on the lot with a basement or a foundation.
Which is why an attached garage, if you took the sense that that was a separate structure, would be a concern, because it is affecting the footprint.
Yes.
So, again, that distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I think
So
arguably when, I think it's one of those situations where I know it when I see it. I know what an attached garage looks like, and it's not a drive under in the, underneath first floor living space. It's not an attached garage. It's a
Well, you should go on to the internet and look at the definitions of garages and attached garages because they're all over the place.
I'm sure
Sounds
In your
like a
spare
good thing
time,
to
Bernard.
Put into the land use ordinance
Yeah,
at
I think
the
we ought to
least.
clarify it. I agree with you, but I think we ought to clarify it in the land use ordinance. I think the language ought to be changed there. The last issue I have, which is also confusing, which needs clarification, is the resource protection zone overlay and what's permitted in it, and whether expansions are permitted at all. And I know we've allowed them, but the question is, should we be allowing them? And this one, I think Amy really ought to give an opinion on. Going back to where Ed was on 88A, an expansion of use. Okay, you can read that a couple of different ways, but it clearly does not state that it's permitted in the resource protection zone. And if you go back to the 8, I think it's 8.1. I got so many bookmarks in here, they're not useful anymore. 8.3 and so forth, and 8.3A shall not be changed, a non-conforming structure shall not be changed, extended or enlarged in any manner except as provided in this subsection after obtaining a permit within any zoning district. There's a preface there, but I think the preface there is meant for the permit. It's not meant to say you can go into any zoning area. And I think that's what the problem is.
I mean, I have the same argument I did last time. First of all, Ed would remind me that 8.3A and B, et cetera, applies to structures, not use.
Yes, it does.
But, again, I come back to the wording of 8.8A. We are in several zones. The resource protection is an overlay over the shoreline, but we are in the shoreline zone.
Right.
And we're a residential structure. And this board, again, has allowed expansion of residential use in a resource and shoreline protection zone in the past. And it's not fair to this applicant to all of a sudden, on an unclear ordinance, make that significant of a policy change.
Okay, except that if you go to the gristmill decision, which was recent, in which the judge clearly stated, the opinion clearly stated, that even though you're in the shoreland zone, okay, it is not permissible to do in the resource protection zone. If it's not permissible in the resource protection zone, you cannot do what is permissible in the shoreland zone if they both overlap.
And in the resource protection zone, residences are not allowed unless they're grandfathered pre-existing. This is a grandfathered pre-existing residence that the resource protection zone was overlaid on it. It's also in the shoreline. It doesn't say in the resource protection zone regulations that you can't expand a residential use. There's no prohibition against that.
Yes, but it's very clear in the ordinance all the way through that if it's not listed as a permissible action in the resource protection zone or any zone, it is not permissible.
Not that it's not but you said action. It's uses that we're talking about, and residential use is not allowed
That's
unless
and what you're doing is an expansion of use.
Right, because it's in the shoreline zone. This ordinance clearly could have said, and this board can go to the town for clarification of an amendment that says, but not if it's in the resource protection zone. It does not say that.
You don't have to say that. You don't have to say that.
And the board has not taken this position in the past.
No, the board has not taken the position in the past, but based on this opinion, I think the board needs clarification. Because just because it is allowed in the shoreland zone does not mean it's permissible in the resource protection zone. Clearly, there are special provisions for expansion in the shoreland zone for structures, and that would apply to expansion of use. Okay? But, they don't give any special provision for expansion in the resource protection zone. And
they do of the structure, because it's within any zoning district. Structures have to meet 8.3 in order to be expanded. The use, in any zone, you can't expand a non-conforming use in any zone unless it's a residential use in the shoreline zone.
that's not necessarily the way I read 8.8A.
It's up to this board to determine, but it's a major change from what you've done in the past. And yes, you can read it two different ways. I like consistency. I like the way the board to continue doing it as it has, unless you amend the ordinance to change that.
Okay, well, I really think we need an opinion for Amy on this, given the gristmill decision.
You're all looking at one.
I don't have a dog in this fight. I wasn't here for the gristmill decision.
And that applied to the gristmill. It doesn't apply to this case. It applied to the gristmill.
Okay.
That was a unique situation.
Not so unique, not so unique.
In general, I was predisposed to look at this as being very similar to the houses, to the properties that are all surrounding this and all in the same designated area by the Fish and Wildlife people. I still think it's anomalous that for some reason, the cutout wasn't made to show that this house lot wasn't to be excluded from the resource protection zone. So I think I'm biased to read the ordinance the way I'd like to read the ordinance. And I think the language clearly allows this particular case. I agree with Nina that I'd like to have Nina advise the board on this particular issue for going forward and toward the idea of clarifying the ordinance, but I don't think it should be changed in the middle of
I think Amy,
adjudicating
you
this
mean
particular.
Amy should
Amy,
advise the
yeah.
board.
Amy, that is what I meant.
I'm not gonna do.
Sorry if I said it wrong.
Well,
Th-
I can't find my pages on the gristmill, but I think the gristmill is applicable to this. I really do.
Aside from the gristmill, can you, because we haven't talked about this in previous meetings, so this was kind of thrown on us here, so it's a good point to raise. But within the resource protection zone, is there a specific portion in the ordinance that says this is not allowed?
No, but it doesn't
Okay.
have to. Because basically, what you have, if you go back to 415,
417.
417,
Yeah, you have kind of a catch-all phrase, you know, in the beginning of
Oh,
the
that's
ordinance.
structures and
Where it says
setbacks,
if it's
no.
not specifically allowed.
I mean, 417 says 250 feet.
it's 4.2. Any land use which is not listed as a permitted use or a conditional use shall be prohibited. The land uses prohibited in each zone are listed below when they go on to list them. Except as otherwise provided, any accessory use is permitted in each zone, subject to and so forth, and that's not even applicable. But basically, use which is not listed as a permitted use or a conditional use shall be prohibited. And that's their way of saying no.
No, and that's right, and that's why this application is in front of the board, because residential, single-family residences are not a permitted use in the resource protection zone. However, this one's grandfathered.
Right.
Now,
But the
having said,
expansion is not grandfathered.
the expansion is not prohibited, given that it's been grandfathered.
No,
There's
No, I
nowhere
would-
that
In
says
the
that.
shoreland zone, but not in the resource protection zone.
not in the
I'm
resource.
sorry?
Not in the resource protection zone.
No,
And it's in both zones.
But it doesn't prohibit
It doesn't prohibit it in the resource protection zone.
It could have
There's
right
nowhere
in
that it says that.
8.8A
but you
said that.
don't have to because of
you do.
4.1 and 4.2.
4.1, okay, I was looking at 417.
4.2, read the first line there. Okay. Any land use which is not listed as a permitted use or a conditional use shall be prohibited.
Can we look at quickly, and maybe this will help, 4.15 B10. And it says activities and land uses requiring approval, not form, from the planning board. And 10 says, this is kind of a catch-all, uses similar to uses requiring approval from the planning board. Would that, I know it's kind of vague, but it's kind of a catch-all if it's allowed in other,
They may
zones.
occur in the resource protection zone.
But then it goes on to list those.
sorry, where are you at?
Page 423 in my printout,
423.
And then number 10.
top of the page there.
Top of page. Uses similar to use requiring, no,
I mean, the fact that this is a grandfathered structure and the issue of the expansion not being allowed because it's within the resource protection zone, but it's grandfathered. So how do you equate the fact the grandfathering part of it, you just can't expand it at all? Even though other uses, similar to uses requiring approval from the planning board, I mean, that, it's allowed in every other zone, it would be, but for the fact it's within the resource protection zone.
You can't extrapolate to say then it's allowed in the resource protection zone. It doesn't work that way.
I guess I'm having a hard time extrapolating that.
Section is for the resource protection.
Yeah.
Yes, I know,
Oh, okay.
but I don't think that applies there.
I mean,
don't
Nina
think
and
we
I
can
don't
speak-
disagree. Residential uses are not allowed
Right.
in the resource protection zone unless they were pre-existing before the RP zone was created.
Right.
That's the situation. If the town wanted to prevent expansion of residential uses in the resource protection zone, even if it's in the shoreline zone, they could have added that in 88A. They did not. Yes, we're in the resource protection zone, we're also in the shoreline zone. That meets the clear wording of 88A. I don't know any other way of saying it.
No, that's not what the gristmill opinion says.
The Chris Mill opinion was to have a use that was not permitted in the resource protection zone added. This is permitted in the resource protection zone because it's grandfathered.
Only because it's grandfathered.
It's
Remind me,
permitted.
But
is there a
it was-
DEP application
the-
here? Has there been a DEP application on this site? Is that part of this proposal?
Steve? I don't think one's needed.
I'm looking at, I may be wrong, 417. 6, permanent structures and expansions thereof projecting into, no, never mind, that's over body of water, forget it.
You want to make sure that doesn't fall.
Okay, I hate to say this, but can we put together a letter to Amy which specifically asks this question? Because I think it all comes down to 88A, not overtly mentioning RP.
Yes.
Okay, so that really is the bulk of the question.
Tom, sorry to interrupt, before we go down that road, is it worth taking the board's temperature as far as a yes or no vote in lieu of getting the town attorney involved? If some of us will interpret the ordinance different than others, and that's fine. We're not all gonna see a particular project in the same vein or in the same light within the ordinance. If a majority of the board feels one way, maybe that's the way we should go. I guess in lieu of just saying, all right, let's get Amy involved,
Yeah.
maybe we should poll a vote on that.
I think Amy should be involved. And I'll tell you why. Let me read you part of the court's opinion here. Therefore, the court finds that the drafters did not intend all uses that may be permissible in the underlying zones to be permitted uses in the resource protection zone. They're talking shoreland and
I've read the case, I understand, that's what it's saying. I think Ralph is right, that was a new use on that property, it was not an existing structure.
Not a grandfather.
It's not a grandfather, that
But
structure was
just
gone
because it's
for a long time.
grandfathered doesn't mean it's expandable.
I guess I interpret the ordinance differently, so,
Okay.
that's all.
So the issue is not about the house itself, it's about the expansion of the house, right?
Yes.
Yep.
And then there's also the issue that this was the only property that seemed not to be carved out from the resource
That
protection
is not an
zone.
issue.
That's not an issue for us.
That's just a nuance.
just-
We have to take it
Interesting
as
sidelight.
it is. We
Okay,
have to take
I'm just
it
saying
as
that
it is.
But the expansion is literally because the number of square feet
Right,
of living space is increasing.
right,
That's what makes this an expansion of use.
okay. Got it. So you're gonna write to Amy, is that the idea?
Well, yeah, I think you have a couple of items, that I think I don't want to necessarily be making arguments, you know, for the board in front of Amy. Because I think there's gonna be some questions on clarification. Because I think you have, you know, I think you have kind of two arguments. You know, you have you have one argument that says, you know, you have a non-conforming use that's not permitted in that particular zone. Kind of take the grandfathering off the table for the moment. And you have one trail that takes you down a path that says, well, you can't add any square footage to it. You know, that's an activity that's not allowable because that triggers your expansion of use. So that's one argument. Then you have another argument that takes you down the road that allows for expansion of structures in any zoning district, you know, and arguably resource protection is a zoning district, you know, when it comes in front of this board, you know, that's a separate, you know, so
I'm not
that's.
sure the ordinance says in any zoning district. That's for permit. That's when they're talking about permits. It carves out the shoreland zone. It
Well,
could have carved out the resource protection zone.
If you follow it through, it does put you back to, I mean, it does put you back to any zoning district. All I'm saying is that that's another argument. Okay, so you have one that says no, then you have one that says, well, maybe, because it's any zoning district. But then I do think the third piece of just the designation of the zone itself is I believe is a little bit more than a nuance. You know, because of the fact that you do have specifically other developed properties that are all carved out of the RP. Every other house on that surrounding Lake of the Woods is carved out of resource protection, with the exception of this one. And so I don't think it's an insignificant nuance, especially in this particular case.
But I don't think the board has jurisdiction to basically make a decision that it shouldn't have been in resource protection to begin with. And I agree with you, it shouldn't be in resource protection. But I don't think the board has the jurisdiction to.
Yeah, I would agree
to
with
say
that. You know, because then I think another, you know, so another option is that, so you go back to say, all right, so who created the map in the first place? You know, the map was created initially by Inland Fisheries, you know, and so I guess a third option is go back to Inland Fisheries and say, all right, hang on a second, what happened here? You know, you carved this out, this out, this out, what happened here? Was that intentional? Like, was there some specific reason why that was left?
Can you petition to?
That we're not aware of.
Can you petition to take it out of resource protection within Inland Fisheries?
Well, and this is a weird part with how the language is written, arguably, because it's a data set that's managed by Inland Fisheries. And I think you could get into a real fun legal debate on this one. But arguably, when you've got when you have a data layer that's managed by an outside agency that is not under the jurisdiction of the town, they could change it. You know, at some point, they could modify that data layer. And the part that makes me somewhat uncomfortable with that is that on some level, changing maps, you know, have an argument that they are modifying zoning. Without the town's permission. I mean, we're debating it right here, you know, as to whether or not, you know, just a potential mistake on a map makes a huge difference, you know, in the overall zoning of the property.
But Warner.
Because arguably, if that little piece wasn't on there, this application wouldn't even be in front of the planning board. You know, because potentially if the house was, you know, would be reconstructed such that it met all the 75-foot setback, you know, requirements, then from a use piece, it wouldn't be here. You know, it would be a CEO decision. So I think the IF&W data layer is, in my opinion, is a significant piece. You know, is a significant piece, and my suggestion would maybe be to start with that. You know, would start with that piece of it before going down the road of RP, because that has much broader implications for many other properties as opposed to just this one.
Can I just ask?
I mean,
isn't that why the ordinance specifically gives the code enforcement officer the sole authority to interpret zoning maps?
I wondered who was gonna find it.
Who is that?
Right,
We ought to get that guy in here.
right, exactly. Ask him what he thinks.
Beat the crap out of him.
So, yeah. And in all fairness, I think before, I would, fall on my sword over that, I would want to have a consultation with inland fisheries to just,
Yeah.
make a better educated, final determination on a boundary like that. But I think that's where I would start. Because that's really the really big argument is RP and use.
So who's going to approach the
So-
inland fisheries?
I mean, I don't have any issue with making that, with making that call and, and making, making that inquiry and, and seeing where that goes.
Can they
Okay.
move fast enough?
And there's no guarantees on that,
I know.
but,
Well, all they'd have to do is give you an interpretation, right? They don't have to change the map. If
Yeah,
you've got
right.
discretion
Yeah.
over interpreting them.
that's right. If I have a written, if I have some kind of written opinion from them, then
Yeah.
that works, that works for me.
All right.
But,
In the meantime, Neil made a suggestion, and I think it's a good one, of you ought to at least pull the voting members of the board to see if a majority just wants to grant this or not. You may not, but I think at least we need to get that polling to see.
I don't want to say yes or no until,
I understand,
that
but
last issue is
we'd like
clarified.
to hear
I
from
mean,
all 5 voting members.
I'm fine with the house. If it weren't in resource protection zone, I wouldn't care.
I understand your position.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify, Nina, your opinion is that the ordinance, as you interpret it, does not allow for expansion of a use in the resource protection zone?
Right.
That's simple.
Yeah, it's that simple.
And the counter argument would be, it says shoreland zone, and this particular house is in both shoreland and RP.
Well,
I-
and then I would counter
I
with,
know.
the gristmill says that it doesn't matter, that it's in shoreland zone if it's not permitted in the resource protection zone.
But that was a new use.
Right, it's not an expansion, but it seems to be the same thing.
We've been through this. Tom, what's your opinion, Mr. Chair?
No, I guess based on, I don't know, it says it does not specifically include RP in that 8A. So,
Yeah.
I don't know, I would. And I think we still have to, I think we should ask Amy for your interpretation, feed it to her and say, now 888 says shoreland, this thing is both. Is that a problem? But considering what was said here, and I think you can pretty quickly write a letter on that, we could get an answer. And in the meantime, maybe Werner could look it up with talk to IF&W. I doubt they're gonna do anything with any speed, but maybe we can all be surprised.
I'd just like to be comfortable with an opinion letter that, protects the board
Yep.
from making the decision to go ahead,
Mm-hmm.
Or something from Warner that takes it right out of our hands.
Well, that's still
I mean, I'll
independent
reach
of what
out,
he
I'll
does.
reach
I'd
out to
like to
IF&W
get
on
Amy's
that
opinion
piece
for
of it.
next time.
Yeah, I would like to get Amy's opinion anyway, because I think this is gonna come up again.
Yeah. So I think, because it really does all come down to 888A with,
Yes. Yeah.
so, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to continue deliberation for another bit. So if I would get a.
But the good news is you probably don't have to make any more presentations.
That'd be nice. No more letters. So, if I understand it right, if Werner gets an interpretation from IF&W that it's out of resource protection, then
And it's out
this
of the
whole
planning
discussion-
board.
Then we're happy,
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've already seen it, but it's,
yeah.
okay.
But we also would like a clarification on
Well,
888 from Amy in terms of that.
So, let me clarify that piece. It's still in the planning board's jurisdiction, but it's for the
Shorelands.
reconstruction, relocation to greatest practical extent, the shoreline zone.
Yep.
And expansion of use in the shoreline zone.
Strictly
Yes, it
Not-
would still be in planning board.
So not expansion of use, but it's reconstruction or relocation to greatest practical extent, because you've got a portion that doesn't
Yeah.
meet 75. If the whole thing meets 75, then it's, you know, at that point, then it's
Out of-
it's out.
Okay.
But
Okay, can I have a motion to continue deliberations next time, please?
I'll make a motion to continue deliberations to the next
you need a
meeting.
Second, please. All right, in favor? You're not, okay.
So,
But, Ed, did you vote on that?
Yeah, he did. I'll go along.
Okay, so it's 4-1. You guys don't.
We don't
vote
get to-
tonight, yes. Okay, so, can you produce a quick, very short letter to Amy on,
Yeah.
on 888
Yeah.
and copy Ralph, of course. Well, you're just gonna give it to Werner, but we'll give it to Amy, I presume.
Yep.
All right, so, that brings us at last to item 190202, Donald and Kelly Jenkins, Peterson Design Group authorized agent. And this will be the public hearing. I think we have some other questions to ask various things on this particular item.
The chairman of the board. How come I wasn't sent this? And I'm right opposite the house. You get sent it by the mail.
No idea.
Well, you sent it.
I did.
That's what he did.
No, I didn't. But anyway, when the public hearing comes, you can talk right now.
Okay.
All right?
Hello again, I'm
Hi.
Eric Peterson from Peterson Design Group in Kennebunk. I think I gave a brief synopsis of this project last time, but in a nutshell, there's an existing house at 25 Pier Road that is currently in the two different flood zones that exist now are represented by this bigger arc. There's a, oh, I'm sorry, it's this arc. This is existing B zone on the outside of this arc, and an A zone on the inside, and the whole house, the whole property is within the flood zone. But half of the existing house, which is this dotted line, sits in the B zone now and is below the current flood elevation. So I sat with Werner when this client first approached us about what could be done with this property, and he gave me the guidance that really nothing can be reconstructed in the V zone, so nothing can be built on this side of this flood line. His recommendation was that we reconstruct the building with no expansion on the good side of what would be the proposed or existing flood line, whichever was more restrictive. And in most cases, the proposed flood line is more restrictive than the current flood zone line. In this case, it's opposite. The proposed flood zone is actually in a better spot. It permits more use of that lot. But because that hasn't been adopted yet, we have to live with today's flood mapping. So this location puts the house completely outside the V zone and in what is the A zone now, and reconstructs it in a way that is no closer to the street than the front line of the current house. This dashed line is the line of the face of the current house. The proposed house sits just behind that by a foot or so. It's a smaller footprint of structure on the lot. The existing house, two overhangs. You can see that in your packet, there's a fold-out that shows that the existing house is 1,349 square feet. And what we're proposing is 1,174 square feet for the house. The existing driveway is 512 square feet. We're getting it down to just about what's required by the town zoning ordinance for 2 parking spaces, which is 400 feet. We're proposing 410 square feet. Currently, there's a pretty large deck that goes right up to the seawall. That's 389 square feet. We're proposing steps only, no deck. That brings it down to 130 feet. The retaining wall is 295 square feet, and we are proposing that that remain unchanged. Also, the propane tank is about 8 square feet. That remains unchanged. Werner recommended that instead of reconstructing a deck, that we do a grade level patio instead, because it meets more closely the FEMA language for structures in the flood zone. So we're proposing to use the remaining amount of square footage that we had for lot coverage as a grade level patio that's in front of the house. So this house is smaller than the existing house in footprint. It's no larger than the existing house in area or volume, and it's elevated on a pier foundation so that it meets the current and proposed flood elevations by the 2 feet plus the adjustment for the new datum for flood mapping. Let's see, there's a fence that goes all the way around that deck now that would come down. And it doesn't exceed the height restriction, the underlying height restriction in Cape Porpoise zone. It also needed a permit by rule from the DEP, which we have received, so that permitting has been done. Trying to get any other pertinent information. More conforming, smaller footprint. Certainly more conforming to the flood mapping.
Okay.
And in character, architecturally, not that you're a design review board, but it's a New England style building. It's a sort of a Cape style house.
Okay,
So it's sensitive to the structures that are around it.
thank you. I have a question for Werner. The Pierce and Donath, when they, a year ago, came to us to take the existing house and change its use from a seasonal
Seasonal
to
to year-round.
expand the use from seasonal house to full-time house,
To year-round, correct.
to year-round.
Yep.
Now, there were a collection of things they were going to do to make that happen. And now we're tearing it all out and replacing. Did they do any of those things? Or did they just sell it without ever doing a thing relative to the,
Yeah, so I can't tell you if they did. I have not been inside the house.
did they pull permits?
Well, some of the items, that were discussed wouldn't necessarily have required a permit.
Okay.
Through our office. So for instance, putting a year-round water meter in, would not have, the water service wouldn't have required a permit from us. Because I think that was one of the discussion pieces, whether or not they did upgrades to the heating system, and, in some of those cases, for instance, we don't issue permits for heat pumps or anything like that.
So,
But all that to say is that I've not been in the house, so I can't,
okay.
can't sit here and say that those things
Is
were
the
done.
house, after this thing when they came to the board last year. Did we officially declare it a full-time, year-round house right then, so that we don't have to do anything further?
I mean, I think you expanded,
We
you
officially expanded the
you
use to-
expanded the timeframe to a year-round home.
Okay, so this is fine. They're basically taking down an existing year-round home and replacing it with another year-round home.
Correct.
Okay.
Because you made that determination.
We made that determination, whether
made
they
that
actually ended up
determination.
doing anything that they were talking about.
you
it
made
doesn't
that-
really
you made
matter.
that allowance
We made
that
that
allowed it
allowance
to-
that they could be full-time.
I
Correct.
forget who wrote the findings
I
on
did.
that,
Yeah.
but I don't remember levying any conditions.
No, I
So-
don't
so I
recall.
think-
I provided
Well, the
the,
only condition was the state condition of the plumber, basically, but that didn't have to be done for us to approve, basically.
yeah, there was only one occurrence of part-time conversion from seasonal to full-time house had to do with the plumbing inspector or something.
Yeah.
That
That's
was the
right,
only-
yeah.
The only
Yeah.
occurrence in the whole
The-
thing, and of course, this is going to deal
Yeah.
with plumbing
The
inspector,
seasonal
I expect.
and the seasonal conversion, the seasonal conversion language doesn't apply in this case
Correct.
because it's on town sewer.
Yes,
The seasonal conversion ordinances that you have really deal specifically with camps, that are located on a lot of great ponds and things like that, and it's dealing specifically with, with septic systems.
okay,
So-
so,
You're saying this was an expansion of use
Yes.
of
We-
a house
we
in
did.
the resource protection zone,
it was,
and we approved it.
we did.
Yeah, we did. We did a lot of
Yeah,
them.
I know that's gonna blow your
Okay.
mind, but,
Didn't make it any bigger,
But-
though.
Right.
right. And I think that's probably
But
that's
it
probably
was
the
an
key
expansion of
difference is
use.
that
It was
there's
an expansion of
It was
use,
an
there's no
expansion
question.
of use by the time frame. And the language, that you have in the ordinance specifically state, it does say within existing within existing structures.
We expand, again, I know we're going back here, but just as we talked to Amy about this last one, Tom, we just approved an expansion of use in the resource protection zone, and we're saying we're not worried about when we expand it for a longer period of occupancy, but we are worried about it when we increase the number of square feet.
No,
That's the issue. Yeah,
That's what we just
yeah,
decided.
that's it, yeah.
no, we're concerned about both, basically.
Okay.
I think the nuance for the last one is, there's, depends how you deal with existing structure.
I withdraw the question.
Okay.
Being consistent.
All right.
All right, so I guess I will open the public hearing. Are there any people from the public who would like to speak? Go to the microphone, please. Go to the microphone, please. You cannot be heard on the tape if you don't go to the microphone. And then identify yourself, thank you.
John Phillips. Sometime within the last X number of years, that house has been raised this way, not torn down. And it must have had to come before the planning board at some point when they put a new foundation under the house. But I don't know whether it occurred at the time you were talking about, last year or
No,
not.
it was not the year.
Well, I think your history showed that it had been raised, correct?
I don't know a whole lot of the history, honestly, but I do know that, because my client just bought this house, I didn't know anything about it before then.
Yeah, well,
So, but they did tell me anecdotally that,
well, some of my other neighbors may remember it, although the ones that are closest to the house aren't here tonight. And I don't know whether that has an effect on what's been done or is going to be done anyways.
they told me that it was raised and put on a new that it used to sit almost on the ground.
Yes,
And that it was put on a concrete pier foundation, but not high enough to floodproof it.
yeah, I have no idea what the floodplains were and stuff like that at the time that it was done. I can't believe that it was done and it didn't come before the planning board.
It probably did, but it was a
Excuse me?
number of years ago.
I don't know.
It
Do you
never
remember,
came before the planning board, and
Mike?
I've only been here for 6 or 7 years, so, but it could well have come
Yeah,
before.
I
that.
can't fix the date for you when it was done, but I know it had been done.
Sure.
My recollection from looking in the files is I think it was in the mid-nineties,
Okay.
was when that foundation was put in, from what
But
I,
it didn't
from what I
change
recall.
the size at all.
No, it was just it was a pure foundation, that was put in. It may have come before the planning board. That I can't recollect, but I do remember, when looking in the file that, a building permit had been issued to put in
Replace
a replacement foundation.
Well, I don't know whether it's an issue that affects what he's here for tonight or not, but just for your information, it was done.
Okay.
I'm sure, do you remember it, Martin?
No.
No? I do. You do, okay. Somebody confirmed what I said.
I was told by them that they were told by the town they had to raise.
Microphone?
Oh, you need to go to the microphone
Microphone,
if you're gonna
please.
say
Let
something.
him talk.
So it sounds like we're accepting, and Werner confirms that in the 90s it was raised up.
Yeah, I thought I was just providing information that I wasn't hearing, that it had been raised higher at some point in time, and,
But not high enough is the key.
but apparently, I don't know where the lines were at the time, as to
That's right.
the flood lines, as to whether it was raised or not.
Yeah.
So, that was our primary concern. He's already indicated that it meets volume and it meets square footage. It's smaller. It looks to me like basically they've taken the long dimension of the house and done it 90 degrees, so the long dimension is a long pure road now. Is that correct?
Essentially, it was a rectangle before, now it's a smaller rectangle
Right.
rotated.
So
Yes.
if it meets all those requirements, my only concern is that the town likes its charm and we're about to tear down some of its charm and to put up a house, and we can't tell from the information that was sent to us. We know that it's not higher than the current house, but we don't know whether it's gonna be a McMansion or what. And I personally am sort of disappointed, but I don't think there's anything we can do about it.
Well, under the land use ordinance,
Excuse me?
under the land use ordinance, you are allowed to replace a foundation. And you can elevate a house, but there are height limits, so they couldn't go above that, and
Yeah.
I don't believe he's gone
Well,
above
I
those
can't
height
speak to any
limits.
of those details. You'd have to talk to the prior owners.
Right. If you want to see what the house is going to look like, you can go down to the code enforcement office, and he will have a set of the plans.
Well,
And
I
you can-
have the elevation views, and I guess some of my other neighbors didn't get them, I don't know why, but I got them, and I'm not real close to the house.
We don't send out complete applications, to abutters, or folks that are on the list. All we send out to folks is just a notification
Yeah.
that an application has come in and that folks are welcome to come.
I thought this came with a letter from the chairman of this board, but I may be in error and not.
No, we did, there were some folks that made requests to see portions of the application. We had some folks that came in, which we made photocopies for them. I also know that I believe the Donaths asked for an electronic version, and we scanned some of it and emailed it, so, and I
Well, I'm
think.
pleased to have received it, but I have no idea. Why would I be the only one that would have gotten this letter? And I think it was from, was it from you?
No.
Okay. But I have it.
Okay.
Well, I don't have anything further to say. I don't think I've provided any more insight into you or not.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Back to John. Please. Identify yourself.
Good evening. I'm Mike Weston. I'm an abutter, direct abutter to the property. The house was raised before we moved here. We moved here in '99. So when we moved there, the house had already been raised. So it was sometime in the '90s. But I've looked at the plans and I've seen the drawings of the house and everything, and I think it's a change and everything's changing. That house that is going down has been there since well before the 1900s and before. But I've seen the house, and I think the house is very attractive. I think it's sort of a New England type of a thing. And I think it blends in well, but with the neighborhood, but I'm really concerned about that lack of bird-friendly glass on the front side. But
It
other
won't
than-
cost $80,000 to do it though, either.
Other than that, you know, the only thing I say about glass is the whole front of my house is glass. And I live right on the harbor. And I've never had a bird hit those windows that I know of since I've lived there since 1999. Anyway, that's my editorial for the day. But I think that the plans, it doesn't affect my view. It may affect somebody else's view, but it doesn't affect mine. And it's I think, very attractively done. And even though it's a change, I think it's okay.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Wish to speak? Hearing nothing, I will close the public hearing. Any board members wish to comment or do anything further?
You probably mentioned this earlier, but how much more are you gonna raise the house above the,
Oh, so the current, the lowest current elevation inside the house is 11.32. And the flood elevation there currently in that area is 14. So, I don't know, I mean, I can't imagine it hasn't flooded.
yeah?
We're proposing that the proposed flood elevation for that area is 12. And we are proposing that the finished floor will be at 14.75. Because it's 2 feet, the town requires 2 feet higher than the base flood elevation, but the new flood elevation is calculated from a different datum than the 1929 NGBD, and that difference is about 9 inches. So this puts it 2 feet higher, plus the consideration for that difference in calculating it meets it just, it's just high enough to meet the proposed flood elevation.
Okay, just above 14 feet, 14 point.
14.75 will be the floor
Okay,
elevation.
got it, okay, thank you.
Yep.
Anyone else? Okay, I'll get a motion.
Motion to approve? That gentleman has a question.
Wait, there's one more.
Sorry.
Just want to clear up, the letter that I have was sent to you by him,
I see.
and how I got a copy of it, I have no idea.
Okay. That explains it.
Postal Service.
All I know is the town sends out the mailings, we don't send the mailings directly, so.
Yeah. Okay, anyway,
So
we have a motion.
I move to
I'm looking
approve.
for a second.
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor? Okay, so it's approved, so we'll have FOF next week, or you want to?
I have FOF now if you want.
Go for it.
Okay.
Super, thank you so much,
We're going to
appreciate
read
it.
the finding of facts now, which will
Oh.
mean that you do not have to come back.
Perfect, thank you.
Well, he's got to get a notarized.
Well, you have to get it notarized once it's signed. And I don't, and our pet notary has left.
Probably not too happy.
Is Lisa,
Not too happy with having to come back to
Take care of it.
Thanks.
Well, there are a couple of corrections that need to be made, and I'll make them as I go along.
Okay.
All right. Okay, this is Kennebunkport Planning Board findings of fact and decision for the application of Donald and Kelly Jenkins, application number 190202, 25 Pier Road, Kennebunkport, Maine. Following site
Please, talk about outside.
Following site plan reviews pursuant to the Kennebunkport Land Use Ordinance held on March 20th, 2019, and a public hearing held on April 3rd, 2019, the Kennebunkport Planning Board makes the following findings of fact and conclusions and renders the following decision subject to conditions enumerated below. The findings of fact are as follows. The applicants and owners are Donald Kelly Jenkins, the applicant, with a mailing address of 2025 Southwest Cottage Street, Ocala, Florida, 34471. The property has a street address of 25 Pier Road, Kennebunkport, Maine. The property is identified as map 30, block 1, lot 17 on the municipal tax assessor's maps. The applicants have authorized the firm of Peterson Design Group of Kennebunk, Maine, to prepare documents and plans and represent them in this application. The applicant has demonstrated a legal interest in the property by providing a warranty deed recorded in the York County Registry of Deeds, Book 17810, page 678, on September 28, 2018. The property is located in the Cape Porpoise East Zone and is completely within the shoreland buffer, 250-foot buffer, and the resource protection zones. Both the lot and the structures of the property are legally non-conforming under the land use ordinance. The lot is less than 40,000 square feet required for a residence in either resource protection or shoreland zones. The structure also fails to meet the setback requirements of LUO Section 4.17A. The property comprises 0.18 acres, or 8,015 square feet, and contains a single-family residence that occupies 56.38% of the lot. The lowest floor of the residence building is at an elevation of 11.32 feet, which is not in compliance with the required elevation of 13 feet based on the current flood elevation of 11 feet for this area. In an application dated February 18, 2019, the applicant proposes to remove the entire existing structure of the exterior dimensions 64 by 37 feet, 6 inches, and replace it with a slightly less non-conforming residential structure with exterior dimensions 51 feet, 6 inches by 44 feet. The proposed new structure will have a reduction of 55 square feet interior living space and 310.77 cubic feet of volume reduction. The applicant reasoned and the board agreed that this met sections 8.3b1, 8.3b3, 8.3b4, and 8.3b5 of the land use ordinance, which requires that the replacement structure comply with the expansion limits and setbacks to the greatest practical extent. The applicant proposes that the non-conforming setbacks will be minimized, excuse me a minute, to the extent feasible by building the smaller replacement structure in part of the same footprint as the existing one and relocating the new residence as far from the water as possible while not being located any closer to the street side property line than the pre-existing structure. In addition to the original site plan application package, the applicant provided these supplemental documents: a current and revised site plan for reference, a set of plan and elevation for the proposed new house, area and volume calculations for the existing and proposed structures. And here's where I have to change. Applicant's main DEP permit by rule notification form to remove existing dwelling, build new dwelling structure in the same location is granted.
You've probably already got it at your office because it was submitted probably
Okay.
4 weeks ago.
I had pending there, so I'm just going to change that to granted. And we should initial those changes. And will be provided to the code enforcement office when issued. I'm going to take that out too. Okay. The proposed floor elevation of the new structure will be no lower than the elevation 14.75 feet, which meets the requirement of being 2 feet higher than the proposed FEMA flood elevation of 12 feet. FEMA flood elevation adjusted for the new National Geodetic vertical datum. The applicants have requested no submission of performance waivers from the requirements of the Kennebunkport Land Use Ordinance. Pursuant to the requirements of Article 1010A of the Land Use Ordinance Guidelines for Decisions, the Planning Board shall approve a site plan application unless it makes a negative ruling on one or more of the following identified findings which would otherwise compel denial. A, the proposed use meets the definition of specific requirements set forth in the Land Use Ordinance and will be in compliance with the applicable state or federal law. Finding, yes. Comment, the proposed replacement of a non-conforming structure satisfies the requirements of LUO 83B5. The proposed decrease in living space of volume makes the structure and lot less nonconforming. Nonconforming setbacks are minimized. The proposed use will not create fire safety hazards and will provide adequate access to the site or to the buildings on the site for emergency vehicles, yes. The proposed exterior lighting will not create hazards to motorists traveling on adjacent public streets and is adequate for the safety of occupants and users of the site and will not damage value or diminish the usability of adjacent properties. Finding yes, residential lighting only. The provisions for buffers and on-site landscaping provide for adequate protection to neighboring properties from detrimental features of the development. Finding yes. The applicant assured the board the best management practices would be employed for erosion control during demolition and construction using at minimum staked silt fence and mulch erosion barrier. The proposed use will not have a significant detrimental effect on the use and peaceful enjoyment of abutting property as a result of noise, vibrations, fumes, odor, dust, glare, or other cause. Finding yes, it's a single-family residence. The provisions for vehicular loading and unloading and parking and for vehicular and pedestrian circulation on the site and on to adjacent public streets will not create hazards to safety, yes. The proposed use will not have a significant detrimental effect on the value of adjacent properties, which could be avoided by reasonable modification of the plan. Finding yes. Proposed structure architecture is consistent with the neighborhood. The proposed use will not have a significant detrimental effect on the value of adjacent properties, which could be avoided by reasonable modification of the plan. Finding yes. The design of the site will not result in significant flood hazards or flood damage and is in conformance with applicable flood hazard protection requirements. Finding is yes. Comment, the proposed elevation of the first floor will be at least 2 feet higher than the FEMA requirement of 12 feet at this site. Adjacent provision has been made for the disposal of wastewater or solid waste and for the prevention of groundwater or surface water contamination. Finding yes. Adequate provision will be made to control erosion or sedimentation. Yes. Adequate measures will be implemented to control erosion and runoff during demolition and construction. Adequate provision has been made to handle stormwater runoff or other drainage problems on the site. Yes. The proposed water supply will meet the demands of the proposed use or for fire protection purposes. Finding yes. It's public water, no change from existing structure. Adequate provision has been made for the transportation, storage, and disposal of hazardous substances and materials as defined by state law. That's not applicable. The proposed use will not cause unreasonable highway or public road congestion. Yes, single-family residence. Existing off-site ways and traffic facilities can safely and conveniently accommodate increased traffic generated by the development as far away from the development as effects of the development can be traced with reasonable accuracy. That's not applicable. When the proposed development will be located within the shoreland and resource protection zones, in addition to the requirements of the Kennebunkport Land Use Ordinance, Article 10, the townwide regulations in Article 6, the performance standards for specific activities and land use in Article 7. Approval of the development will also require that the board make positive findings based on information presented that the proposed use will maintain safe and healthful conditions, yes. Will not result in water pollution, erosion, or sedimentation to surface waters, yes. Will adequately provide for disposal of all wastewater, yes. It's public sewer. Will not have an adverse effect on spawning grounds, fish, aquatic bird, or other wildlife habitat, yes. Will conserve shore cover and visual as well as actual points of access to inland and coastal waters, not applicable. Will protect archaeological and historical resources as designated in the comprehensive plan, that's not applicable. Will avoid problems associated with floodplain development and use, yes. Is in conformance with performance standards set forth in Section 5.6 of the Kennebunkport Land Use Ordinance, yes. Adequate control measures will be incorporated into the demolition and construction process. Conclusions, Article 1010A of the Land Use Ordinance mandates that the planning board shall approve a site plan application unless it makes one or more identified findings that would otherwise compel denial. And as noted above, the board makes no such findings. Decision, the site plan application identified above is hereby approved. And the conditions of approval pursuant to Article 1011 and 1012E. The applicant pursuant to 1012E shall notify the planning board prior to the transfer of rights to construct an approved project. The applicant must record a copy of this decision and provide proof of such recordation in the York County Registry of Deeds before any permits may issue and before any construction activity may commence. Approval of this application is dependent upon applicants receiving a valid permit from the MDEP prior to construction. Copy of the permit must be filed with the Code Enforcement Office within 1 week of receipt. Now, here's one I'm not sure we should keep in. Applicant pursuant to LUO 5.16B shall first obtain a seasonal conversion permit from the local plumbing inspector. We don't need that. That's what I thought.
We just, I mean,
We already did that.
we already see first season.
So I threw it in just in case we needed it.
Yeah.
Okay, so everyone can initial that change too. The applicant shall comply with all terms and conditions of the Town of Kennebunkport ordinance as well as the main DEP approvals, including details of erosion control measures for use during demolition and construction, and a statement clarifying how applicant will revegetate the property on completion of construction. April 3rd, 2019. Okay.
Can we have a motion to approve those as read? Second?
I'll second.
Okay. So those are approved, and we just need to get them signed off, and you need to make the same corrections on both.
Right. So I'll do
I'll
that
let
right.
you.
Super. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Okay. So, I guess I will entertain the next motion while we're signing.
Right.
Second. To dismiss?
Two. So I've heard a motion to adjourn and a second.
Second.
So, all in favor? Okay, we're off.